On April 24th, Mr. Global, who is Matt Randall, he's the vice president and principal of a company called Sentinel Energy from Oklahoma, runs what we used to call a stripper operation. And he responded to one of the videos I made about Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative Party leader in Canada, wanting to build more pipelines, and I argued against it. And he rebutted my argument, and he did a really good job. I mean, very level-headed, facts-based. I appreciate that because that is not the usual response I get to my energy analysis. But he made 2 points, and I want to talk about those because I have a counter argument, and you can decide for yourself whether I'm right or Matt is right. But I got a response to what he had to say. So he made 2 points, two broad points that I want to reply to. The first one, oil global oil demand may peak in 2028 or 2030, but U.S. demand will decline very little. He says about 5% by 2050. And he uses, if you look very carefully at the little graph that he has up on his video, it comes from the US EIA, the Energy Information Administration. It's a very credible organization, but it's also considered to be a little conservative and kind of falls in between, I would say, the very conservative OPEC and the middle of the road International Energy Agency. But also look at the date on that graph, 2020. Any forecast from 2020, it may well have been from 50 years ago. I mean, there's so much has changed in the last 5 years that any forecast from, 5 years ago is just completely useless. So that's a big problem I have with Matt's take on this. The other thing he says is that most everyone agrees about these, and I can tell you nobody agrees on this stuff. There are a large number of agencies, government agencies, consulting firms, and so on that do global energy demand analysis, in particular oil analysis. And frankly, I read a lot of them. OPEC, ExxonMobil, International Energy Agency, Rystad Energy, S&P Global, Bloomberg NEF, Canadian Energy Regulator, on and on and on. And understanding those models takes a lot of work, especially the assumptions behind them. I'm not a math guy, so I look at the assumptions and then compare that to what we see in the real world data. And so nobody agrees, folks. And the question is, do the forecasts and the assumptions line up with the data we see? So in the modeling that he's talking about and all the other modelers, they generally have three scenarios. So they have a business as usual scenario, and then they have a rapid decline scenario, and then they have a very rapid decline scenario, which is tied to net zero by 2050. And even OPEC, if you look at their model, World Oil Outlook 2045, and then the updated 2050 from last year, they think that North American oil demand will decline significantly between now and 2050. 5%, not a chance. They think much more than that. In OPEC's case, they think that decline will be offset by a very rapid rise and large rise in the global south. Grist for another conversation. But what I think, based on all of the modeling I do and all of the data and the studies I read, I think the most likely scenario is the International Energy Agency's middle scenario, their announced policy scenario. And it sees oil peaking at about 103 to 105 million barrels a day by 2030, maybe 2028, but that would be a bit of a stretch. And then declining by 50 to 57 million barrels, almost half. So that's not 5%, that's almost half by 2050. That's a big decline. So I think that's not a bad rebuttal of Matt's argument. The second thing he argues for, he says, look, the U.S. shale play, while the U.S. may be the biggest producer in the world right now at 13.2 million barrels a day, the shale plays that underpin that are just about to head into terminal decline. And that's true. And the break-even costs per well are going up. So, and that's also true. The thing that he doesn't mention is that the shale producers have also been innovating. They've been introducing a lot more new technologies. They've been refining the processes that they have, and so their efficiency has been going up, and that's been keeping them competitive. And who says that they won't innovate and become more efficient in the future? So I would not go so far as to say that the U.S. is for sure the shale is going to decline. I think my guess is that the U.S. has got a while yet before it climbs down from its 13.2 million barrels a day production that it has now. But let's assume for a moment that it does decline between now and 2050. And he says that because he doesn't think that the domestic demand will decline, not much in terms of electrification of transportation, I guess. That's the biggest use of oil. And he says Canada is best suited to backfill as the shale basins become they decline. That's not true. He's making a common mistake here in thinking that the Canadian ultra heavy sour crude that comes out of the oil sands, because that is not only is it Canada's biggest oil export at 3.3 million barrels a day, it's also the only basin in all of Canada that could see any kind of significant increase. Okay, so that's number one. You cannot, when you have heavy sour crude like that, you have to modify the refiner at the cost of billions of dollars, and probably to outfit a refinery that doesn't have, like cokers on it to handle the heavy crude would probably cost, I don't know, many billions, 10 billions. It's a lot of money. And refineries now, faced with potentially declining demand, are very reluctant to put that capital in. So right now there's 5.5 million barrels a day of heavy crude refining in the U.S., and most of it is down in the U.S. Gulf Coast. And then that's actually probably not true. The most of it is in the Midwest, around Chicago, Detroit, about 2.5 million barrels a day. And then there's some in California, there's some in the Rocky Mountains, and then the rest is in the U.S. Gulf Coast. And Canada already supplies 65% of that, 3.3 million barrels a day of heavy crude. So uh, we've already got most of the market and competing against Latin American suppliers. So, but let's then grant Matt his assumptions. Let's say that U.S. Oil demand remains relatively flat, shale production declines and has to be backfilled with something, and maybe that something is Canadian oil. Then, well, already right off the shelf, there's 650,000 barrels a day of existing pipeline capacity that could be put into place. Existing Alberta to U.S. export capacity. And the capacity would be freed up, according to the pipeline companies, using surface friction reducing agents and also stronger pumps. And we've seen that they've done this already for the last 10 years to increase the shipping capacity of their pipelines. On top of that, it's important that you know that this heavy crude, when it comes out of the ground, it's like peanut butter. It's bitumen. And what you do to make it flow in a pipeline is you have to dilute it with a diluent, which is a lighter hydrocarbon, to about 20 to 30%. And that diluent doesn't have much value, right? Doesn't certainly not as much as the oil. There is a technology in Alberta called partial upgrading, where you upgrade the heavy crude to either a medium crude or a heavy crude that will flow in a pipeline, and it adds $10 or $15 of value to the barrel, so you get more money for your product, and you free up 20 to 30 percent of the pipeline space you already are using that's dedicated to the diluent. So if we need to ship more Canadian oil down to the U.S., would we be smarter to build new pipelines, or would we be smarter to increase the existing capacity by 650,000 barrels and then partially upgrade that bitumen so that we free up space in those pipelines for more heavy crude? So not only I think is Matt, I would argue, is weak on the side of what's going to happen in global oil demand, but also this idea that Canadian oil could be easily substituted for light sweet crude from the Permian, from the Bakken, from other shale plays. It just doesn't stand up on the face of it. And combined together, oh, and by the way, when I was talking about Pierre Poilievre supporting pipelines, he's supporting pipelines to the east, to the west, to the north. Nobody wants to build new pipe. Nobody in Canada wants to build one more pipeline, not a single pipeline down to the U.S. because of President Trump and his tariffs, and we are. Uh, I mean, it's a matter of national policy now. Break our dependence on the U.S. So there, the oil demand scenarios are wrong, in my opinion. This idea that you can substitute Canadian oil for light sweet crude oil is wrong. And then, of course, we don't want to build pipelines south anyway. So altogether, I think that's a pretty good rebuttal of Matt's argument.